All right, so welcome to the deep dive, where, we kind of take this big pile of interesting stuff, and we boil it down to like the good bits that, you really need if you want to get smart fast, right?
Exactly. No more slogging through tons of reading. We
Yeah.
we do the heavy lifting for you.
Yeah. So today we are diving deep, deep, deep into the mind of Arthur Schopenhauer,
Ooh.
and particularly his very, very strong opinions about education.
Oh, he had some thoughts.
He did. We've got this excerpt where he lays out exactly how he thinks, we should be learning to really understand the world and, importantly, how to deal with the hard parts of it, the struggles.
Yeah.
So get ready because, some of what he says, it might totally change how you think about learning.
They might. What's so interesting about Schopenhauer's take, even now, is how, he really criticizes what we usually think of as like good education. Like maybe the way we're taught is actually, setting us up to misunderstand things or even, suffer more than we need to.
Right.
So for you listening, if you're trying to get really smart quickly, Schopenhauer's ideas, they give you a framework to, think about how you learn and make sense of things. It's not just about what you learn, but like how and when.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. Schopenhauer, right at the beginning, he separates natural method of education from the artificial method. And that seems like it's like the core of his whole argument, that difference.
Totally. Imagine like someone who's completely alone, no schools, no books. How would they learn?
Right.
Well, Schopenhauer says they'd use the natural method, like firsthand experience comes first, and then you form like general ideas based on what you've seen happen over and over. So like you touch a rose bush, you get pricked by a thorn, and after a few times you figure out, okay, roses have thorns and they can hurt me.
Yeah.
The important thing here for Schopenhauer is that you really understand the connection between what you saw happen and the bigger idea.
So you're learning by you're building your knowledge from the ground up. So the artificial method is like the opposite of that, right?
Exactly. The artificial method, that's what most of us go through in school,
Yeah.
Like we're given these big ideas from teachers, textbooks, lectures before we've really had a chance to experience them ourselves.
Right.
We learn the rule before we see it play out in the real world.
Yeah, and Schopenhauer, he thinks there are some real problems with that way of learning. He talks about how you could misuse those big ideas, right? And that makes, if you haven't actually seen something happen, how do you know when to use that idea and when not to?
Exactly. Without that base of personal experience, Schopenhauer is saying we're way more likely to take these abstract concepts and try to make them fit where they don't really belong.
Right.
So we might judge people wrong, misinterpret things because our understanding is more theoretical than real.
Yeah.
He even thinks this could lead to a kind of, fake confidence in young people. They might have a ton of knowledge about the world, but no real practical wisdom in the world.
Right.
It's like having a map, but never having actually walked the land.
I love that. That's such a good analogy, the map versus the terrain. And Schopenhauer actually uses that image of putting the cart before the horses, right? You're trying to use these abstract principles without having the actual experience to kind of guide you.
Right.
It seems so inefficient, maybe even harmful.
Absolutely. Schopenhauer thinks that artificial method actually stops you from developing your own judgment. If your head's already full of other people's ideas, you're less likely to really pay attention to think critically for yourself. You become more like a container for other people's thoughts than an independent thinker.
Right, right.
And it's kind of wild how, this still applies today, even with all the information we have now. Are we, so busy taking in information that we forget to really experience it and process it firsthand?
That is such a good point. I think we've all had times where you know something intellectually, but it doesn't really hit you until you've lived through it yourself.
Yeah.
So for Schopenhauer, the natural method is better because you build that real understanding of how the specific things you see connect to those bigger ideas. And that makes you interact with the world in a much more accurate and effective way.
Exactly. When you, grow your understanding from your own experiences, you get a much deeper, more nuanced sense of how those general principles actually work in different situations.
Yeah.
It's stronger knowledge.
Yeah. Okay, and he doesn't stop there. He also really focuses on the order in which we learn, the sequence. It's not just about the method, it's about the timing.
Exactly. For Schopenhauer, the best way to learn is to start with specific observations, then move to smaller ideas based on those observations, and then finally form those big general ideas. He thinks a good education system should copy this natural process. Think of it like building a pyramid, right? You need a solid base of facts before you can build the higher levels of understanding.
And what happens if you mess up that order, in his opinion? Like, what if you jump to the big picture before you've got all the details figured out?
Well, Schopenhauer warns that messing with this order leads to what he calls deficient general ideas, meaning your big concepts are weak, like they're not really backed up by evidence.
Right.
And even worse, this can lead to false general ideas, these fundamentally wrong understandings of the world that just stick with you. It's like building that pyramid on, like a shaky foundation that the whole thing is messed up.
That makes sense to me. I can think of times when I was learning, even with easy subjects, where something just didn't click until way later. It's like I was missing a piece, you know?
Yeah. And Schopenhauer, he knew that would happen. He says that even simple things can be confusing until later in life because we might have missed some important basic stuff early on. This shows how crucial it is to learn step by step, whether it's in school or just exploring on your own. And it's interesting to think about how much of our education system today, with its focus on big overviews and intro classes, might actually be going against this principle.
Yeah. It's like we're getting the movie trailer before we've even seen the characters, you know?
Right.
Another point he makes that I find really interesting is about the danger of using words without actually understanding them. Like just memorizing terms and phrases. We've all met people, maybe even in college or something, who can use all the fancy jargon but don't really get the ideas behind them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer saw this even in kids.
Yeah.
They might focus on memorizing stuff just to get by in school instead of trying to really understand.
Right.
And he thought this was a big problem that could easily continue into adulthood, leading to what he calls mere verberia, basically.
Yeah.
A bunch of words hiding a lack of understanding. It's all talk, no substance.
So it's not about how many big words you know, it's about how deep your understanding is. And again, he comes back to that idea that you have to have those specific real-world observations before you can get those abstract concepts that the words represent.
Exactly. He even compares it to like a baby being born feet first. It's like the wrong order and it can be dangerous. Or imagine a poet who tries to write a poem by starting with the rhyme scheme instead of the idea or feeling they want to express. The point is, real understanding, it goes from the specific to the general, from the concrete to the abstract, not the other way around.
Yeah. And that leads right into his critique of preconceived notions, those like ready-made ideas and opinions that he says are often grafted onto young minds, which is kind of a scary image.
Yeah. Schopenhauer argues that a lot of the time, the way we teach is like injecting these preformed ideas, these biases, into kids who don't have enough real-world experience to judge them. It's like they're given the answers before they've even asked the questions. Think about how many of our beliefs about society, politics, even ourselves, come from what we were told when we were young, not from what we actually experienced.
Right. And then as we go through life, we try to make our experiences fit into those pre-existing ideas, maybe even ignoring evidence that contradicts them, just to hold on to our worldview.
Exactly. Schopenhauer thinks that when what we experience clashes with our ingrained beliefs, we tend to reject the experience instead of questioning the belief. We'd rather stay comfortable, even if it means being wrong. He describes how long and difficult it can be to unlearn these early misconceptions through life's hard knocks. And, it's kind of a sobering thought that many people might go through their whole lives living under those unexamined assumptions.
That sounds like a recipe for disappointment, Bad decisions, maybe even harmful actions. And obviously his preferred approach is the opposite. Let those general ideas and judgments come from your own observations and experiences.
Exactly. He believes that when our understanding is rooted in what we've seen and done ourselves, we get a much richer, more accurate view of the world. It might take longer than just being told things, but the knowledge you get is much stronger and more truly your own.
Which brings us to his emphasis on the value of direct experience with reality. He seems to think we often protect kids from the real world too much, favoring, copies like books, stories, and other people's opinions.
Yeah, Schopenhauer is worried about filling young minds with what he calls chimeras, these fantastical ideas and unfounded opinions from books, fairy tales, and all that. He's afraid this creates a warped view of reality which leads to unrealistic expectations and then trying to force the world to fit those false visions. He thinks it's dangerous to prioritize secondhand accounts over experiencing things firsthand.
It's interesting that he specifically mentions things like fairy tales. I guess he's worried that they give, like, a sanitized or too perfect version of the world, which doesn't really prepare kids for the complexities and, sometimes harsh realities of life.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. He's wary of creating a gap between the imaginary world, with its simple stories and happy endings, and the real world, which is often messy and unpredictable. He even quotes Antisthenes, who said, "To unlearn evil is the most necessary discipline." That really highlights the importance of getting rid of those early errors and illusions so we can see reality more clearly.
Okay. And he also has some, strong opinions on what age is appropriate for learning certain subjects, especially the more abstract ones that are easily misinterpreted, like philosophy and religion. He says we should wait till later in life, right?
Yeah, he's pretty firm about that.
Yeah.
Schopenhauer says kids under 15 shouldn't really be exposed to theories and generalizations that are likely to be wrong, especially in areas like philosophy and religion. He thinks that's because the ability to judge things maturely develops later, in the teenage years. So teaching those complex and controversial subjects early on could lead to misconceptions that really stick with you and can be harmful.
So what does he recommend focusing on in those early years? What kind of intellectual diet does he prescribe for kids?
He says to go for subjects where there's less chance of being wrong, like math, or subjects where mistakes aren't such a big deal, like learning languages, observing nature, and studying history as a collection of facts.
Okay.
For Schopenhauer, childhood and youth should be about collecting materials, getting really familiar with the concrete individual things in the world. The big interpretations and abstract thinking, that can wait until you can think more critically.
That's pretty different from how we usually do things now, where we introduce kids to big philosophical and ethical questions pretty early on. It makes you wonder if we're rushing things, like he says.
It really does. Schopenhauer's perspective challenges the idea that earlier is always better when it comes to tough subjects. He thinks we might be hurting kids by pushing them into these areas before they're ready. Maybe we're instilling biases and preventing them from developing their own independent thinking. Maybe we should focus on building that strong base of knowledge first and then get to the abstract stuff later.
But he does think it's good to exercise your memory while you're young, right? He knows that kids and teenagers are good at memorizing.
Oh, absolutely. While he warns against teaching complex theories too early, he's all for using that powerful memory while you're young.
Right.
But he also says it's super important to choose what you memorize carefully. It should be the most important, fundamental knowledge, the kind that lasts across all the vital areas. And it should be chosen by experts, basically a bedrock of facts that you can build on later.
So it sounds like he's saying build a strong foundation of knowledge when you're young, then do the deeper thinking and analysis later when you're better equipped to handle it.
That's it. He pictures this kind of intellectual canon that experts keep updating to make sure young people are memorizing the most valuable stuff. That would give them a great starting point for building a more nuanced understanding later on.
All right, so moving on, he talks about the maturity of knowledge. What does that mean exactly? It seems like it's more than just knowing a lot of facts.
You're right, it is. For Schopenhauer, mature knowledge isn't just about having a lot of information. It's about making a strong connection between abstract ideas and what you observe in the real world. He says that in truly mature understanding, every abstract concept should be based on real observations, and every observation should link back to an abstract idea. It's like a back and forth that shows real intellectual maturity.
So it's like theory and practice working together, the abstract and the concrete, each one informing the other. You can't just have one without the other.
Right. He says this level of integration takes time and comes from experience. What we learn from observing and what we learn from being taught, they gradually come together and improve each other. When you're young, there's often a gap between your abstract knowledge, which you might have just learned from words, and your actual experience. True maturity and knowledge happens when those two things meet and correct each other.
Okay. And finally, he gets into the importance of understanding how the world really works and how tough that can be, especially with the influence of novels and fictional stories.
Yeah. Schopenhauer thinks that getting an accurate and deep understanding of how the world functions, with all its messiness and unpleasant truths, is the most necessary but also the hardest thing to learn. And he thinks it's made even harder by fictional stories, especially novels, which often give a romanticized and unrealistic view of things. And young people tend to believe those stories.
So he sees these often idealized stories as actively misleading us, not just leaving us uninformed, but actually distorting how we see reality. That's a pretty harsh critique of fiction.
It is. He thinks these fake, sentimental ideas mess with the lessons we learn from our own lives, making it much harder to understand human nature and how the world works. He even says that people who haven't spent much time reading these romanticized stories like artisans and mechanics who work with their hands and deal with practical problems, might have a more accurate view of things.
That's a pretty critical take on literature, though he does say there are some exceptions, books that show a truer picture of life.
Yeah, he acknowledges that, but he's still worried about fiction creating a warped perspective, especially for young minds that can't yet tell the difference between fantasy and reality. In the end, he's pushing for a clear-eyed, honest understanding of how things really are, without the romantic illusions.
So, to sum up Schopenhauer's main point, it seems like he's saying that real understanding and the ability to deal with life's challenges don't come from just passively taking in information. You have to build it from the ground up, through experience, observation, and forming your own conclusions.
That's a great summary. He's basically advocating for a way of learning that's rooted in reality, where your experiences shape your worldview, instead of trying to fit your experiences into pre-existing ideas.
It definitely makes you think about how you learn, Can you think of times when you might have fallen into that trap of learning the theory before really getting the practical application?
Oh, for sure. And that leads to a big question for you, the listener. How could you focus on direct experience and observation in your own learning, even in your everyday life, to get a deeper, more resilient understanding of the world?
Right.
It's worth thinking about whether we could all benefit from being more like Schopenhauer, maybe by stepping away from just consuming information and engaging more directly with the world. It might be the key to a more grounded, insightful, and maybe even less stressful life.
Yeah. And what stands out to you the most, from Schopenhauer's perspective on this?
Well, what really strikes me is I think his emphasis on how easily we can get stuck in these preconceived notions. We get these ideas planted in our heads, often when we're young, and we hold on to them so tightly, even when they don't really match up with reality.
Right, right.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems, I think. I mean, it can make us resistant to new information. We shut down instead of being open to learning and changing our minds. And it can make us judge other people unfairly. We see them through the lens of our own biases instead of trying to understand them as individuals.
Yeah.
And I think Schopenhauer's right. It is hard to break free of these preconceived notions, but I think it's worth trying. We can start by just being aware of our own biases and by being willing to question them and by actively seeking out new experiences that challenge our existing beliefs.
Yeah, yeah. And even just being open to the possibility that we might be wrong,
Exactly.
That's a big one.
It is. And it's not always comfortable, but it's how we grow, right?
Right.
It's how we learn and evolve and become, more well-rounded individuals.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, what do you think? How can we apply this in our own lives?
Well, I think one way is to be more mindful of the sources of information that we're exposing ourselves to.
Yeah.
We should be critical of everything we read and hear and see, and not just accept things at face value.
Yeah.
Right. And we should also try to get out of our own echo chambers.
Yeah.
Talk to people who have different viewpoints than our own. Read books and articles that challenge our beliefs.
Yeah.
The more we expose ourselves to different perspectives, the more likely we are to break free of those preconceived notions that Schopenhauer was talking about.
And I think another thing we can do is to just be more present in our own lives,
Yeah.
Pay attention to our experiences, really observe the world around us, and not just, go through life on autopilot, Really, really be there and experience things.
Because that's where the real learning happens, right?
Okay.
It's not in the books or the lectures. It's out there in the world.
Absolutely. So, for you listening, I think the big takeaway here is to really be curious.
Yeah.
To ask questions,
Yeah.
to be open to new ideas, and to never stop learning.
That's it. Never stop learning.
So thanks for joining us on another deep dive.
And until next time, keep diving.
Yeah.
Keep exploring.
You questioning everything.
Everything.
Yeah. All right.
Bye.
See ya.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.